Yeah, so the literal sense of Scripture is sometimes misunderstood by people. And I think the right way to think of it, the literal sense of Scripture, is what the original human author intended to convey to the original human audience. And so if we're looking at Genesis, I think that we need to put Genesis back in its context. If you read Genesis as if it is a contemporary textbook on science, I think what you're doing is wrenching it out of its original context, and therefore you're bound to misread it. And that's true of not just Genesis, it's really true of any work, that to understand it, we need to understand its genre, and we need to understand its context. So what is the original context of the Genesis story? Well, the original context, it was written in terms of rival stories of creation, other stories that were circulating in the ancient world, and it was meant to be an answer to those. And it uses poetry, it uses imagery, and that was what all those stories did. And the poetry and the imagery, I would not set that against truth, as if on the one hand you have truth, and the other hand you have poetry, imagery, and story. I think that one kind of truth is scientific truth, the empirically verifiable, but I think it's too narrow to say, well, the only kind of truth is the empirically verifiable. I think truth actually is broader. And in fact, that claim that the truth is empirically verifiable, that's the only kind of truth, that is itself a self-defeating statement, right? There's no empirical evidence that the only way to get the truth is through the empirical method. So if we put Genesis back in its context, what do we see? Well, we see it is a story telling us about, in contrast to the other stories in the ancient world were stories in which there were multiple gods. They engaged in a warfare and violence. So you think of the Greek myths are like this, where, right, Zeus overthrows his father and there's all this violence. And Genesis is meant to answer these other ancient myths. And it's saying things like there's only one God, there's not multiple. Secondly, that creation is not a matter of violence, but that the creation is reasonable speech. And this was something that you talked about in your lecture, which really struck me, because I obviously had read that story before, but I never really thought of it, that, well, creation arrives, right? God says, let there be light, and there was light. And what is reasonable speech? Reasonable speech is orderly, right? The difference between, random sounds you make and reasonable speech is that there's a kind of order to it. So if creation arises from reasonable speech, then creation itself is ordered. It's intelligible. It makes sense. And that gives rise centuries and centuries later, that belief that creation is orderly and makes sense gives rise centuries later to science. Mm-hmm. But to read Genesis as if it's failed science makes about as much sense as to read Genesis as if it's, for or against iPhones. I mean, imagine somebody reading Genesis and they're like, well, should I buy an iPhone or not? I'm not going to read Genesis to determine this. Well, clearly the original author of Genesis wasn't addressing that. And the original author of Genesis wasn't addressing for or against evolution. So I think that these readers who want to make it for or against evolution are just utterly misreading and taking the story out of its original context, and therefore necessarily providing a really bad reading of Genesis.